There is a sentence in your Bible that is physically impossible inside the most famous painting on earth. John chapter 13, verse 23. One of his disciples, the one Jesus loved, was reclining in the bosom of Jesus. Now hold that verse up against Da Vinci's Last Supper. 13 men lined along one side of a long table, sitting upright on chairs and benches, in broad daylight. Try to make the verse happen in that room. You cannot. For John to put his head against Jesus' chest, he would have to stand up, lean across the table, and drape himself over the host in front of everyone. The verse does not fit the painting. And here is the part that should stop you. The verse is the eyewitness. The painting is a guess, made almost 1,500 years later, by a man who had never seen a Passover meal. Once you see the room the way the Gospels describe it, the strange details of that night start snapping into place. Why John could whisper a question and no one else heard it. Why Judas was close enough to share a dish with the man he was betraying. Why washing feet in the middle of dinner was even possible. So forget the long table. Forget the chairs. Forget the daylight. We are going to walk into the real room. Start with the painting, because the painting is the memory most of us inherited. Milan, the 1490s. Leonardo da Vinci spends roughly 3 years, 1495 to 1498, covering the back wall of a dining hall, the refectory of the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie. Monks ate their meals underneath it every day. That was the point. Their supper below, the Lord's Supper above. And Leonardo, being Leonardo, experimented. Fresco painters worked fast, on wet plaster. Leonardo wanted to work slowly, so he painted with tempera and oil on a dry wall. The experiment failed. The paint began to flake almost immediately, and within a lifetime, visitors were already describing the picture as a ruin. In 1652, someone cut a doorway through the bottom of the wall, right at the center. The doorway destroyed Jesus' feet. Hold on to that detail. Feet are going to matter more than you expect tonight. The modern rescue of the painting took 21 years, from 1978 to 1999, 7 times longer than Leonardo took to paint it. A conservator working inch by inch to separate his hand from 5 centuries of grime and retouching. And when the cleaned surface finally emerged, an art historian looked closely at the serving dishes and identified what is actually on the table. Grilled eel, garnished with orange slices, a fashionable Renaissance delicacy, sitting on the table of a first-century Passover. None of this is a scandal. Leonardo was not painting an archaeological reconstruction. Nobody in his era was. He dressed the scene in the world he knew, an Italian table, Italian bread, Italian food, Italian light, as painters always had. The problem is not what Leonardo painted. The problem is what we did with it. We hung it in our minds as a photograph. For 500 years, when Christians close their eyes and picture the night Jesus was betrayed, they see a Renaissance dining hall. The Gospels see something else entirely. Here is what the Gospel writers actually say, and it hides inside a verb your English Bible tends to soften. Matthew 26-20. When evening came, Jesus anacato with the 12, he was reclining. Mark 14:18. As they anakimenon, as they were reclining and eating. Luke 22:14. When the hour came, he anepison, literally, he fell back, he lay down, and the apostles with him. John 13:23. John was anakimenos, reclining, in the bosom of Jesus. 4 accounts. 4 reclining verbs. Not one gospel says that anyone sat at this meal. Not one mentions a chair. Older English translations said they sat at meat, and the upright picture stuck. But the Greek is not ambiguous. These are the standard words for how formal dinners were eaten across the Greco-Roman world. Lying down. And there is one more clue, planted before the meal even begins, that most readers walk straight past. When Jesus sends 2 disciples ahead to arrange the room, he tells them the owner will show them a large upper room. And then Mark adds a single word, estromenon, spread, laid out, furnished. It is a participle of the verb stronomy, to spread something out. The same verb the Gospels use for spreading cloaks on the road on Palm Sunday. A large upper room, already spread. Spread with what? With the furniture a formal banquet required, couches, cushions, low tables. Jesus did not borrow an empty room and 13 chairs. He booked a room that came set up for reclining. The Last Supper was arranged, in advance, as a meal you lie down for. So what did that actually look like? Quick word before we continue. If this kind of study, the original languages, the physical world underneath familiar scenes, is helping you see Scripture with new eyes, consider becoming a channel member. That support is what makes it possible to keep doing this work week after week. And to those of you who already support this channel, thank you. You are part of every script we produce. The dining arrangement of the first-century Mediterranean world had a name, the triclinium. Picture a room where the furniture hugs the floor. Low-cushioned couches arranged around low tables, often in a U shape, with one side left open so servants could reach the food. Each guest lies at a diagonal, propped on his left elbow, so the right hand stays free for eating. Heads toward the table, at the center. Feet angled away, toward the outer edge of the room. Sandals off at the door, no individual plates and no forks. Flat bread, torn and used as the utensil, dipped into shared bowls. That is the posture the gospel verbs are describing, and the moment you load it into the scene, details that always felt slightly odd become obvious. Start with the hour. Da Vinci's window shows a bright afternoon sky, but Mark says Jesus arrived with the 12 when it was evening. And Paul calls it the night he was betrayed, because Passover was a night meal by law and by custom. So strike the daylight, light the room with oil lamps, small flames, moving shadows, faces half in gold and half in dark. Strike the risen Italian loaves too. This is the feast of unleavened bread. The bread on those tables was flat, because leaven had been cleared out of every house in Jerusalem that week. And now the feet. Earlier that evening, John says, Jesus got up from the meal, took a towel and a basin, and washed his disciples' feet. Put that scene in the paintings room and it turns awkward. 13 men wedged behind a table, feet buried underneath it, each one having to turn and shuffle and make space. Put it in the real room and it flows. 12 men reclining, heads in toward the food, and their bare feet resting at the outer rim of the couches, presented outward. Reachable, one after another, without anyone moving at all. The real room was built for the foot washing, which makes it one of history's quieter ironies that when they cut a doorway through Leonardo's wall, the part of the painting the doorway erased was the feet. But this raises the sharper question, why were they lying down at Passover? Of all meals, because the first Passover was eaten the opposite way. Exodus 12:11. This is how you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste, standing, dressed for the road. A meal eaten by slaves on the edge of escape, one hand on the bread and one hand on the door. That was the founding posture of this night. And by the time of Jesus, Israel had deliberately turned that posture inside out. The rabbis eventually wrote the rule down, and the wording is stunning. Even the poorest man in Israel must not eat on Passover night until he reclines, and he must be given no fewer than 4 cups of wine, even if the money comes from the charity plate. Mishnah Pesachim 10:1. Now, honesty about the sources. The Mishnah was compiled around the year 200, roughly 170 years after this meal, and scholars genuinely debate how much of the later Passover liturgy was already in place in the year 30. That caution is fair, and you should hear it. But notice what you do not need the Mishnah for. The Gospel verbs already have Jesus and the 12 on couches. The custom, the rabbis later codified, is visibly, physically present in that upper room. And the logic of the custom was the whole sermon. In that world, posture announced status. Slaves stood and served. Free people reclined and were served. So on the one night built to remember slavery, everyone reclined, even the beggar, because the meal itself was the announcement. We ate standing once, because we had to run. Tonight we eat lying down, because we are free. The posture was not comfort, it was theology, performed by the body. Which means Jesus did not recline that night out of habit. He reclined because the meal required every Israelite to eat like a king. Now put the men on the couches, because this is where the room stops being background and becomes the drama. The Gospels hand us 3 fixed points. Fixed point 1, John. He is reclining, in his own words, in the bosom of Jesus, which in triclinium terms means directly in front of him, one place to the right, lying with his back toward Jesus' chest. And when Peter signals him to ask a question, John does something that only works in this geometry, anapison epi to stethos. He leaned back against Jesus' chest and said, "Lord, who is it? Tip your head back a few inches, speak just above a breath. And only one man in the room hears you." On chairs, that sentence is impossible. On couches, it is effortless. Fixed point 2, Judas. He is close enough that Jesus can dip a piece of bread and place it directly in his hand, close enough that Mark can call him the one dipping with me in the bowl, sharing the same dish. Fixed point 3, Peter. He is far enough away that he cannot ask Jesus himself. He has to gesture across the room to John and have the question relayed. The man who is always in front is, for once, out of reach. Now, the honest caveat, because it matters. The Gospels do not hand us a seating chart, and any full map of that room is a reconstruction that scholars still argue about. But follow the fixed points, because they push toward a conclusion that should unsettle you. In that dining culture, the couch positions nearest the host carried the honor. And many students of these meals argue the place at the host's left, the spot just behind his own reclining back, was the seat of the honored guest. The one man we know is inside arm's reach of Jesus' hand, sharing his bowl, receiving bread passed from his fingers, is Judas. And in that world, the host dipping a choice morsel and handing it to a guest was not an accusation. It was a gesture of affection, a mark of favor given to someone you delighted in. Read John 13:26 with that in your ears. Jesus identifies his betrayer by honoring him. If the reconstruction is right, Jesus placed the man he knew was selling him to death in the seat of honor beside his own body, fed him from his own hand, and then said, "What you are about to do, do quickly." The painting cannot show you this. It's Judas is pushed back in shadow, clutching the money bag, spilling the salt, obvious at a glance. You would spot him in 3 seconds. And that is exactly what the real room denies you. Because when Jesus said, "One of you will betray me," nobody swiveled toward Judas. They went around the room asking, one after another, "Is it I? Is it I?" 12 men, who had lived with him for 3 years, and not one of them suspected the guest leaning at the place of honor. The betrayal did not come from the far end of the table. It came from whispered distance, and there is one more layer, and it is the deepest one in the room. Listen to the word John chose for his own position, kolpos, bosom. John uses that word for a person in one other unforgettable place, back in the opening lines of his Gospel, John 1:18. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, eis ton kolpon tu patros, he has made him known. Same word, same author. The Son lives eternally in the kolpos of the Father, and out of that closeness he explains God to the world. John reclines for one evening in the kolpos of the sun, and out of that closeness he writes the gospel that explains Jesus to the world. Was the echo deliberate? No, verse steps in to confirm it, and it would be dishonest to claim certainty. But this is the writer who chose every word in his prologue like a stonemason choosing footings, and he described his own place at this table with the exact word he had already used for where the Son is, in the Father. At minimum, John understood something we keep missing. The posture of that meal was a picture of something eternal, head against chest. Close enough to hear a heartbeat. That is where John says the Son is forever. And for one night in an upper room in Jerusalem, that is where a fisherman got to be. So, hold the two rooms side by side one last time. The painting gives you distance. A long table, like a wall between him and you, 13 portraits facing outward, arranged, lit, composed. Nobody touching anyone. The real room gives you closeness. Bodies at diagonals, shoulders against chests, bare feet at the lamplit edges, flatbread torn and passed from hand to hand. A friend's head resting over the host's heart, and a betrayer near enough to feel his breath. The night Jesus was betrayed, he was not presiding from the far side of the furniture. He was down on the cushions with his friends, close enough to feed them, close enough to be leaned on, close enough that even the betrayal had to happen at the distance of an embrace. Maybe that is the correction that matters most. Somewhere along the way, the painting taught us that Jesus stays on his side of the table. Framed and distant, and looking out at us, the room says otherwise. There was no far side of the table, because there was no table like that. And the seat against his chest was real, and someone actually got to lie there. The invitation of that room has never been to admire it from across the hall. It is the posture of the room itself. Lean back. Rest your weight on him. Ask the question you have been afraid to ask out loud, that close. Subscribe if this changed how you see that night, because the scriptures have more rooms like this one. Leave a comment. Even one word pushes this to someone else who needs it. Share this with a friend whose picture of the Last Supper still has chairs in it. And may you learn to rest your full weight, your questions, your fear, your whole story, against the one who let his friend lean on his heart the night before he proved that love. God bless you.